Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the United States, the upstream pillar of the river that supplies 40 million people, sat at 3,527 feet of elevation on the day this video was recorded. The Bureau of Reclamation's May 15th most probable 24-month study projects it to end the year at 3,471. That is 19 feet below the elevation at which Glen Canyon Dam can reliably generate electricity. The most probable case, not the worst case, not the doom case, the base case the federal government is now planning around, has the lights going out at Glen Canyon by Christmas. And the lights are only the first thing to go. The rulebook that has governed the river for 18 years expires 24 hours later. The cities are already rationing. The aquifer underneath 6 states is grinding toward unusability. And the data center industry is building new water demand into exactly the regions running out. 5 dominos, 1 calendar year, no plan. Subscribe to the Sky Lab and follow the story all the way through. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and which lake or reservoir you depend on. Share this video to help us reach the people who do not yet know December is the deadline. Now, let's break this down. Part 1. The line where the dam goes dark. There is a single number on a federal spreadsheet, a number most Americans have never heard of, that is about to decide what the next decade of life in 7 states actually looks like. The number is 3,490 feet. It is the elevation, above sea level, of the surface of Lake Powell at the point where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably generate electricity. The engineers call it minimum power pool. Below that line, the water sitting behind the dam is still there, but the turbines that turn it into power for roughly 5 million customers across 7 states begin to lose the head pressure they need to spin. The lights, in a real and measurable sense, begin to go out. Lake Powell, on the day this video was recorded, sat at 3,527 feet and change. It is 37 feet above the line, and on the 15th of May, 2026, the United States Bureau of Reclamation released its monthly most probable 24-month study, the document that more or less tells the American West where its water is going to be at every point over the next 2 years. That study, the most probable scenario, the one the Bureau labels not as worst case but as expected, projected that Lake Powell will end the calendar year on December 31st at an elevation of 3,471 feet. 3,471 feet. That is 19 feet below the line where the dam stops producing reliable power. Read that one more time. The expected case, not the bad case, not the doom case. The median, 50% likely, this is the trajectory we're on case, is that Glen Canyon Dam goes below minimum power pool by Christmas of this year. The most probable outcome, on the Bureau of Reclamation's own paperwork, is that the second largest reservoir in the United States crosses a threshold this December that was historically used as a worst-case planning backstop. The worst case has become the base case. There is a real human texture to what that actually means, and it is worth walking slowly through it because the abstraction here is so large that the mind tends to slide off of it. Glen Canyon Dam, built between 1956 and 1966, is the upstream pillar of the Colorado River system. The water held behind it is the supply that, through 100 years of legal agreements and downstream releases, ends up irrigating the lettuce in your salad if you live anywhere in the United States, ends up in the tap that fills your glass if you live in Phoenix or Tucson or Las Vegas or much of Los Angeles, and ends up running the turbines that send electricity onto the western grid at the precise moments of the summer day when electricity demand peaks. The dam, when fully operational, generates somewhere on the order of 1.5 million kilowatts of power. It serves around 5 million people across the western interconnection. It is not a small piece of the country's energy mix. It is a load-balancing tool that the grid leans on every hot afternoon, and the May 24-month study, in the dry language of a government report, is telling us that this winter, that resource is most likely going away. You will hear people in the comments tell you that worst-case projections from federal agencies are political documents. They are not. The Bureau of Reclamation publishes these studies on a fixed monthly schedule. They are auditable line by line, and the assumptions, the inflow scenarios, the modelling choices are listed in the open. The May 15th study is the same kind of document the Bureau has been publishing for decades, recalibrated each month against the actual hydrology in the actual ground. The trend, month after month, has been downward. The May 2026 edition is not a sensationalist outlier. It is the latest reading of a system that has been losing elevation for 20 years and is now on the most probable trajectory, about to cross the line where the math of a major American hydroelectric dam stops working the way it was designed to work. What does crossing minimum power pool actually mean in practice? It does not mean Glen Canyon Dam fails. It does not mean the lake disappears. It does not mean the water stops flowing downstream to Lake Mead. It means the dam can no longer reliably spin its 8 turbines because the column of water above them is too short to maintain the pressure those turbines were designed for. Some power generation may continue intermittently, depending on exact daily fluctuations, but the dam's role as a stable, dispatchable electricity source on the western grid begins to dissolve. And in a summer when Phoenix and Las Vegas are running their air conditioners flat out, and the wildfires are pulling firefighting aircraft and power crews across the west, the loss of a reliable 1.5 million kilowatt generation source is the kind of thing that begins to show up in your electricity bill, in grid stress alerts, in the price of power across an entire region, and in the operational margin the rest of the system has to absorb the next shock that comes along. It is worth pausing on the physical detail of what happens to a hydroelectric turbine as the reservoir behind it loses elevation. Hydroelectric power is mechanically very simple. Water sits at one elevation behind a dam. It falls, under the pull of gravity, through a controlled channel over a turbine blade. The kinetic energy of the falling water turns the turbine turns a shaft, the shaft turns a generator, the generator produces electricity. The amount of electricity you get out of that process is, to a close approximation, proportional to 2 things: the volume of water flowing through and the height it falls. The height is called the head. The higher the head, the more energy you extract per unit volume of water. Glen Canyon Dam, when Lake Powell is full, has a head of more than 500 feet. The turbines were designed around that head. They were engineered in the 1960s to be efficient at a specific range of head pressures, and they begin to lose efficiency below that range. By the time Lake Powell drops to 3,490 feet, the head has fallen by enough that the turbines are operating below their designed envelope. By 3,470, the manufacturer's specifications no longer guarantee reliable operation. Below 3,370, which the Bureau calls dead pool, the dam cannot pass water downstream at all. Lake Powell would still hold water at dead pool. The river below would stop. We are not at dead pool. We are not even close to dead pool. The May projection has us at 3,471 feet at the end of the year, which is roughly 100 feet above dead pool, but only 19 feet below the threshold where reliable power generation stops. The relevant question for the next 12 months is not dead pool. The relevant question is minimum power pool. That is the line that the Bureau's most probable projection now crosses. The history of how that line has migrated in the Bureau's monthly studies is itself worth knowing. 5 years ago, in 2021, the May 24-month study for the end of calendar year 2026 projected Lake Powell at 3,590 feet. The number has been walking downward at roughly 20 feet per year since then. The May 2022 projection had us at 3,570. The May 2023 projection had 3,540, in part because that was the year Powell hit its previous all-time low at roughly 3,520. The May 2024 projection nudged back up to 3,530 thanks to a wetter winter. The May 2025 projection sat at 3,500, and the May 2026 projection sits at 3,471. The decline is not linear, it is jagged. But the multi-year trajectory is unmistakable, and the projections have crossed the operational threshold in the document that the federal government uses to plan, so that is the first domino. Glen Canyon, by the end of this year, on the Bureau of Reclamation's own most probable projection, drops below the line. And it is not falling alone. There are 4 more dominoes behind it, all scheduled to drop in the same direction, and one of them lands its weight on the calendar at exactly the same time the dam crosses minimum power pool. The American water system has been built on a stack of independent assumptions, each designed in a different decade by a different generation of engineers and lawyers, and in the spring of 2026 those assumptions have improbably aligned. They are all expiring on the same calendar year. Whether by design or by accident, what should have been 5 separate problems for 5 separate decades have all turned up in the same May. Part 2, the Lake the West was built on. To understand why the line at 3,490 feet matters as much as it does, you have to understand what Lake Powell was for in the first place. The reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam is not a natural lake. It did not exist before 1963. Where the lake now sits, in Red Rock Canyon country on the border of Arizona and Utah, there used to be a river, the Colorado, running fast through Glen Canyon on its way down to the Grand Canyon and the Gulf of California. The damming of that river is one of the largest pieces of physical infrastructure ever built in North America. The lake that filled in behind it is the second largest reservoir in the United States, after Lake Mead, which sits about 270 miles downstream behind another dam, Hoover Dam. The two reservoirs together, when full, hold more than 50 million acre-feet of water. They are the savings account of the American West. The reason that account exists is older than the dams themselves. In 1922, in a hotel room in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the governors of the 7 states that share the Colorado River, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, sat down with a representative of the federal government and signed a document called the Colorado River Compact. The compact divided the river's annual flow between an upper basin and a lower basin. Each basin was promised 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year. The math was simple. The assumption was that the river produced enough to honour those promises, and the entire legal and economic development of the American West for the next century was built on top of that arithmetic. The problem is that the arithmetic was wrong. The 7.5 million acre-feet for each basin assumed the river's average annual flow was somewhere around 15 million acre-feet. Modern hydrology, drawing on tree ring reconstructions that go back over 1,000 years, shows that the actual long-term average flow of the Colorado River is closer to 13 million. The compact was negotiated during a stretch of wet years that we now recognize as anomalously generous. The river the lawyers thought they were dividing in 1922 does not exist. It never really existed. The compact overallocated a river that does not produce enough water to meet its own promises. For most of the 20th century this did not matter, because the reservoirs held the gap. Lake Mead filled in the 1930s when the Hoover Dam went up. Lake Powell filled in the 1960s when Glen Canyon Dam went up. The two reservoirs together stored enough excess from wet years to cover the lean ones, and the legal overallocation was papered over by the physical savings account. As long as the savings account stayed roughly full, the math could keep working. The first time it really stopped working was around the year 2000, when a multi-decade dry stretch began in the western United States, and the reservoirs started losing elevation. They have not really recovered since. Tree ring evidence published in 2022 by researchers at UCLA and elsewhere showed that the 2+ decades from 2000 to 2021 were the driest such stretch in the American Southwest in roughly 1,200 years. We covered that study in our video 2 weeks ago on the worst drought in US history. The point is not new, but the implication for Lake Powell specifically is worth saying out loud. The savings account has been draining steadily for 20 years. It is not draining because anyone made a sudden bad decision. It is draining because the river has been smaller than the compact assumed, and the reservoirs are doing exactly what they were designed to do, absorbing the difference, until the absorbing runs out. It is worth understanding for a minute what tree rings actually tell us. A tree growing in the American Southwest year after year records the conditions of each growing season in the width of the wood it lays down. In a wet year, the ring is thick. In a dry year, the ring is thin. The patterns of thick and thin rings, calibrated against modern instrumented records of precipitation, allow researchers to reconstruct what the climate of any specific region was doing in centuries before any instrument existed. The Colorado River Basin has thousands of old trees with rings extending back over 1,200 years. The reconstruction is not speculative. It is the same logic as reading a tape recording. The wood is the recording medium, the rings are the data, and a year-by-year sequence of regional moisture goes back centuries. What the 2022 reconstruction showed, by lining up the rings across many trees and many sites, is that the 2000s and the 2010s were the driest 22-year stretch in the entire reconstruction. Drier than the 1870s, drier than the 1930s, drier than the medieval droughts of the 12th and 16th centuries that other tree ring studies have identified. The drought we are currently inside is, on a continental scale, the worst the Southwest has experienced in over 1,000 years. What changes in 2026 is the rate. Lake Powell lost about 30 feet of elevation over the previous water year, according to the Bureau of Reclamation's data. It has been declining at a rate that places it, on May 15th, 2026, in a position where the next 12 months of expected hydrology cannot be absorbed without crossing minimum power pool. The reservoirs have been a buffer for 20 years. The buffer, on the Bureau's own paperwork, is about to run out. There is something quietly historic about that moment, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. Lake Powell crossing minimum power pool is not the end of the world. It is not the end of the lake. It is not even the end of the dam. But it is the first time in the 70-year history of the modern American water system in the West that a major federal reservoir, on a federal monthly projection, was expected to fall below the elevation at which it can do its operational job. It is the first time the savings account, the buffer, the thing the lawyers in 1922 assumed would always be there, has reached zero on the timetable that the engineers told us it would last forever. And the reason this is happening now, in May 2026, rather than 5 years ago or 5 years from now, is the third part of the story. It is about what was supposed to fall from the sky last winter, and didn't. Compare that to the original engineering envelope. Glen Canyon Dam was designed for a full pool head of approximately 580 feet. The turbines installed inside the dam, the actual physical hardware that turns falling water into electricity, were specified for that head pressure, with a workable operating range that extends down toward roughly 450 feet of head before efficiency losses become severe. The reservoir elevation that corresponds to a 450-foot head is approximately 3,590 feet, 60 feet above the actual reading of 3,527 on the day of this recording. The dam is already operating outside the engineering sweet spot the original designers built it for. The minimum power pool threshold at 3,490 feet is not the edge of the design envelope, it is well below it. The dam, for several years now, has been generating power in a range that the original specifications treated as the bottom of operability, and the May projection is now walking it past the bottom of that range entirely. There is one more piece of context worth holding before we move to the snowpack. Glen Canyon Dam was not universally celebrated when it was built. The environmental movement in the 1960s opposed it on the grounds that flooding Glen Canyon destroyed one of the most beautiful river-carved landscapes in North America. The river runner John Wesley Powell, after whom the lake is named, had documented the canyon in the 1860s, and the loss of that landscape to a reservoir was a defining battle of mid-20th century American conservation. The river guides who had run Glen Canyon before the dam called the resulting lake the place no one knew, meaning the canyon was lost before most Americans ever saw it. There is a quiet irony in the possibility that, on the current trajectory, parts of Glen Canyon may re-emerge from the receding water level as the lake drops back over the course of the next several years. The canyon was inundated in the name of permanent water security. The water security is now eroded, and the canyon, in places, has begun to come back out from underneath the lake. That is not a triumphant return. The exposed canyon walls are mineral-stained, the riparian ecology is gone, and the river that runs through what is left is heavily silted. But the geology of the canyon is intact, and the layered rock that John Wesley Powell described in his expedition journals is, in patches, visible again in the receding bays around the shoreline. The lake the West was built on is, in a real and measurable sense, beginning to dissolve back into the river it was built to dam. Part 3. The inflow that never came. Every spring in the American West, the same quiet rescue happens. Snow that has been sitting on the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains all winter, in Colorado, in Wyoming, in Utah, in New Mexico, begins to melt. The meltwater flows down out of the high country into thousands of streams that braid together into hundreds of creeks, that braid together into a few dozen rivers, that ultimately deliver themselves into the headwaters of the Colorado. By July, that runoff has filled Lake Powell back up by tens of feet of elevation, replacing what was drawn down during the previous summer. The snowpack is, in a real sense, the water bank of the West. Reservoirs are storage. The snowpack is the deposit. In the winter of 2025 into 2026, the deposit did not arrive. By May 4th, 2026, the Colorado Basin snowpack stood at approximately 2.5 inches of snow water, equivalent against a 30-year median of about 10.7 inches, 23% of normal. That number was the lowest reading at that point in the calendar in the modern instrumented record. It was the headline figure in the May 2026 version of the U.S. National Water and Climate Center's update, and on May 5th, the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center issued its water year inflow forecast for Lake Powell, the most probable inflow into the reservoir for the entire water year, meaning the 12 months running from October 1st, 2025 through September 30th, 2026, was projected at 3.27 million acre-feet. That is 34% of the long-term average, about a third of what the lake normally gets in a year. The narrower window inside that water year, the April through July period, is the most critical because it is when the spring melt actually delivers itself to the reservoir. That window's most probable inflow forecast came in at approximately 800,000 acre-feet, about 13% of average for those 4 months. It is the lowest April through July inflow projection in the history of the modern record-keeping system for that basin. The headwater reservoir of the American West, the upstream pillar of the system that supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states, was, on May 5th, projected to receive its lowest spring water delivery ever measured. Snow water equivalent, the measurement that the federal water supply system runs on, is a specific quantity worth understanding. It is not the depth of the snow itself, it is the depth of liquid water you would get if you melted the snow in place. A snowpack that is 10 inches deep in dry powder contains less water than a snowpack that is 10 inches deep in heavy wet snow. So the Federal Monitoring Network does not measure snow depth. It measures snow water equivalent by direct sampling at snowtel sites scattered across the high country and by network-wide averaging that accounts for variations across elevation and aspect. The May 4th reading of 2.5 inches of snow water equivalent across the Colorado Basin meant, in plain language, that the entire winter's worth of snow accumulation in the Rocky Mountains feeding into the Colorado River, averaged across the basin, contained 2.5 inches of liquid water at the moment it was measured. The 30-year median for that date is 10.7 inches. The deficit is enormous. The water that should be sitting on the peaks, ready to melt into the reservoirs, is mostly not there. Now there is a second mechanism at work in this story, and it is the one that makes the May projection worse, not better, as the days go by. The smaller a snowpack is, the more vulnerable it is to early season warmth. A thin snowpack high in the Rockies, exposed to direct solar radiation, with a thin and dry atmosphere overhead, melts faster than a thick snowpack, and the faster the melt, the more of it arrives in April and May rather than in June and July, which means the runoff peaks before the reservoir is operationally prepared to capture it, before downstream demand has actually started, and well before the hottest months when the water would do the most good. The reservoirs are not just receiving less water, they are receiving it at the wrong time. There is a physical mechanism behind the timing trap, and it is worth walking through it. Snow has a property called albedo, the fraction of incoming sunlight it reflects back into the sky. Fresh, dry snow has an albedo of around 80 to 90%. That is, fresh snow sends most of the sunlight that hits it back into space, which is why a snowfield can be cold even on a sunny day. As snow ages, however, its surface becomes rougher, accumulates dust, and develops liquid water lenses at the surface during warm afternoons. The albedo drops. Dirty, aged snow can have an albedo as low as 50%. That means it is absorbing twice as much sunlight as fresh snow. The more sunlight absorbed, the faster the snow melts. So a thin, aged, dust-loaded snowpack, which is exactly what 2026's western snow column was by early May, melts not just because the air is warm, but because the snow itself is increasingly absorptive. The process accelerates as it goes. The thinner the snow gets, the more dust per unit volume is exposed, the lower the albedo gets, the faster the melt goes. The melt curve is non-linear. A snowpack in the worst quartile of years can lose its remaining water in a fraction of the time it took to accumulate. The western United States has, over the last 15 years, experienced a phenomenon researchers call dust on snow. Increasing deposition of fine dust from the warming, drying landscapes of the desert southwest onto the high elevation snow surfaces of the Rockies. The dust is windborne, originating from places like the Colorado Plateau and the Four Corners region where vegetation has been thinning under the megadrought. When that dust falls on the snow, it darkens the surface and accelerates melt. The effect is measurable and large. A heavily dust-loaded snow surface can melt 40 to 50 days earlier than the same snowpack would in a low-dust year. The mechanism is well documented in the published literature, and what it means for the May 4th reading is that the 2.5 inches of snow water equivalent that did exist were likely to melt earlier and faster than even the headline number suggests. And this week, in the week this video drops, the atmosphere is doing exactly the thing the reservoirs cannot afford. A massive megablock is locking into place over the central United States. A continental ridge of high pressure is settling over the central and north-central states, sandwiched between two coastal storm systems in roughly the shape of the Greek letter omega. The northern plains are forecast to bake under that ridge. Temperatures in the Dakotas are projected to climb to 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit through Tuesday and Wednesday, 15 to 20 degrees above the normal late May reading for that part of the country, with humidity collapsing into the teens. That heat does not stay in the Dakotas. It bleeds west into Montana, into Wyoming, into the high country of the Rockies, exactly where the remaining snowpack is sitting on the peaks. And the result is that this week, while the Bureau of Reclamation is publishing its most probable projection of Lake Powell going below minimum power pool in December, the atmosphere overhead is actively accelerating the loss of whatever is left of the basin's snowpack delivery system. That is the mechanism. A 23% snowpack year is bad. A 23% snowpack year with a late May heat dome over the snow is worse. The Bureau's number, 3,471 feet by December 31st, is the most probable case under the May 5th inflow forecast. If the heat over the Rockies this week melts the remaining snow earlier and faster than the forecast assumed, the December number gets worse. The dominos do not just sit there. They actively accelerate each other. And that is only the first domino. The fact that this calendar year was already going to be the year Lake Powell crossed the line was the first surprise. The second surprise is what else expires this calendar year on a completely different track that nobody designed to coincide with the hydrology. 7 months from now, the legal framework that the entire lower Colorado River runs on is set to expire. There is, as of this recording, no signed replacement. Part 4. The rulebook that runs the American West. To understand the second domino, you have to understand a document most Americans have never read and most Americans have never heard of. It is called the 2007 Interim Guidelines for Lower Basin Shortages and Coordinated Operations for Lakes Powell and Meade. The name is the kind of bureaucratic title that makes your eyes slide off it on the way to the next sentence. Resist that. Stay with it for a minute. Because that document is the operating manual for the river that 40 million Americans drink from. It is the rule book. It governs what happens when Lake Meade falls below specific elevations, how Powell and Meade release water to each other, how the 7 basin states cut their allocations, and how the lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, share the pain in a shortage. It is not a treaty. It is not a constitution. It is a piece of administrative law negotiated between elected state governments and the Federal Bureau of Reclamation in 2007, signed off on by all 7 Colorado River Basin states, and operational since January of 2008. It expires on December 31st, 2026. That sentence deserves to land. Read it again. The legal framework that defines how shortages are declared on the lower Colorado River, the framework that has governed allocation reductions to Arizona and Nevada for the last 18 years, the framework that defines the contractual relationship between the upper basin states and the lower basin states for the daily operation of the river expires on the last day of this calendar year, December 31st, 2026, 7 months from the day this video was recorded. This is the second domino, and it lands on roughly the same calendar week as the first. The most probable Bureau of Reclamation projection has Lake Powell crossing minimum power pool by December, and the legal framework governing how the system handles such a crossing expires 24 hours later. The hydrology is hitting its threshold on the same calendar as the law that governs it. Why was it scheduled to expire in 2026? Because in 2007, when the guidelines were originally negotiated, the basin states agreed to a 19-year horizon. The thinking was that a 19-year operating framework would give the basin enough time to figure out what to do about the slow decline of the river, while still leaving room for adjustment as the science evolved. The 2007 guidelines were always meant to be interim. They were never meant to be permanent. The expiration was built into the document from the day it was signed. It is not a sudden surprise. It is a scheduled deadline that has been on the calendar for 19 years, sitting quietly on every water lawyer's wall in 7 states, and the basin has known the whole time that a replacement framework would have to be in place by the start of 2027. What the guidelines actually do, in practical terms, is define a series of elevation tiers at Lake Mead. When Mead falls below 1,375 feet, certain things happen. When it falls below 1,075, certain other things happen. When it falls below 1,050, deeper cuts trigger. Each tier defines specific percentage reductions to specific states' annual allocations. Arizona absorbs cuts at higher Lake Mead elevations than Nevada does, because of historical agreements about the priority of Arizona's Central Arizona project deliveries. Nevada absorbs cuts at slightly lower elevations. California is largely insulated from the early tier cuts because of senior water rights dating back to the original compact. The cuts are not abstract. They are written into the document in specific acre-foot reductions, applied automatically when the elevation thresholds are crossed, with no further negotiation required. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation issues a tier declaration each August based on the August 24-month study projection for the following calendar year. Once declared, the cuts apply for the next calendar year regardless of what happens to elevations in the intervening months. The Tier 2 shortage currently in effect on the Lower Colorado was declared on the basis of one of those elevation thresholds. The Tier 3 shortage that the federal government would likely declare for 2027, based on the May 2026 projection of Lake Mead at 1,056 feet, would impose deeper cuts on Arizona and additional cuts on Nevada. But the guidelines defining the magnitude of those cuts expire on the last day of 2026. What does it mean to declare a Tier 3 shortage when the rulebook defining what Tier 3 means has expired? The honest answer is that, as of late May 2026, the legal mechanics of that question have not been resolved. Negotiations for that replacement have been going on, in earnest, since around 2022. The 7 basin states have been talking to each other, talking to the federal government, talking past each other, and producing a steady cadence of memos, draft proposals, public statements, and formal letters. The Department of the Interior, working through the Bureau of Reclamation, has been the federal convening party. There have been public meetings, there have been workshops, there have been comment periods. The structure of the negotiation has been almost entirely open and almost entirely public. There is no secret. There is no hidden room. The negotiation is happening in plain view of anyone who cares to look. And as of late May 2026, with 7 months to go before the rulebook expires, the 7 states have not reached a consensus agreement. They have not agreed on the basic question of how the post-2026 framework should handle shortage operations, on how upper basin and lower basin states should split the cuts in dry years, on whether the new framework should last for 10 years or 20 years or longer, or even on which agency should have final authority when the states cannot agree. The framework that has been governing the river for the last 18 years expires in 7 months, and the states are still arguing about what the next one looks like. The Bureau of Reclamation, on January 9th of this year, released a document called the Post-2026 Operational Guidelines and Strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead Draft Environmental Impact Statement. It is the federal government's attempt to thread the needle, to lay out a set of alternatives for what the next framework might look like, and to give the public a formal channel to comment. The public comment period ran from January 16th through March 2nd, 2026. It received more than 18,000 submissions. That is an unusually large response to an environmental impact statement. 18,000 individual people, organizations, water districts, tribes, environmental groups, agricultural cooperatives, and city utilities cared enough about the document to write something into the federal record. The Interior Department's preferred alternative, drawn out of that process, is a framework that would last approximately 20 years and that would distribute shortage cuts in a specific way between upper basin and lower basin states. The states themselves have not agreed on that preferred alternative. They have not agreed on most of the alternatives. They missed a November 2025 deadline to produce a consensus-based plan that the federal government could then formalize. And what the upcoming months are going to test, with the rulebook expiring in 7 months, and Lake Powell on a trajectory to drop below minimum power pool in roughly the same week, is whether the basin states can produce an agreement in the time left, whether the federal government will impose one by administrative action, or whether the entire post-2026 framework ends up in litigation. Part 5. 7 months. No replacement. Let me walk you through why the 7 basin states have not been able to agree, because the reason is not bad faith, and it is not corruption. It is a structural disagreement about who absorbs the deepest cuts in the driest years, and both sides have a defensible argument. The upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, sit at the top of the river. The water flows downhill from them. In dry years, they receive less natural flow simply because less water is coming out of their watersheds. They're already, in a sense, taking the first cut. When the snowpack is low, as it is this year, the water that does not exist does not arrive in their reservoirs, and they have less to send downstream. This loss is involuntary. Nobody negotiated it. It is what the sky did or did not do. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, sit at the bottom of the river. They depend on water released from Lake Mead, which depends on water released from Lake Powell, which depends on what the upper basin sends down. Under the 2007 guidelines, the lower basin states have legal allocations defined in elevation tiers. When Lake Mead falls below a specific elevation, certain cuts are triggered, and Arizona and Nevada take the first measurable contractual reductions. California, under the seniority structure of Western water law, is largely insulated from those cuts at the early tiers because it holds older water rights than the other 2 states. So the upper basin's position, simplified, is roughly this. We already take a cut every dry year because of where we sit on the river. Asking us to take additional contractual cuts on top of our natural flow losses is asking us to absorb the same problem twice. The lower basin states have the reservoirs. They get to draw down what we send. They should be the ones to absorb the structural shortage. The lower basin's position, simplified, is roughly this. We have built our economies, our cities, our agriculture, on the legal allocations we hold under the compact and the guidelines. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson, the Imperial Valley, the cities and farms of Southern California. These are real built infrastructure with real populations, and they were built on the assumption that the legal allocations would be honoured. Asking us to absorb a structural shortage that we did not cause means asking us to dismantle infrastructure that took decades to build. The water that physically does not exist is everyone's problem to solve, and the burden of solving it cannot be loaded only onto the people who happen to live downstream. Both sides are right. That is the deepest tension underneath the negotiation. The upper basin is correct that it absorbs natural flow losses without any contractual recognition of the cost. The lower basin is correct that asking it to absorb deeper cuts on top of the ones already triggered by the elevation tiers is asking it to bear most of the cost of a problem that was created by everyone agreeing to over-allocate the river in 1922. There is no obvious version of a new framework that lets both sides walk away saying they were not the ones who had to take the deepest hit. And in the absence of an obvious answer, the negotiation has produced 4 years of drafts, comments, public meetings, and missed deadlines without reaching closure. There is a third party at the table whose role rarely gets enough attention in mainstream coverage, and that is the tribal nations of the Colorado River Basin. There are 30 federally recognized tribes whose reservations overlap with the Colorado River Basin, and a number of those tribes hold senior water rights, meaning, under the prior appropriation doctrine that governs Western water law, their rights predate the rights of most of the basin states. The Navajo Nation, the Colorado River Indian tribes, the Gila River Indian community, and others have legally adjudicated rights to substantial volumes of Colorado River water. Some of those rights are still being settled in court. Some have been partially settled but not fully implemented. The post-2026 negotiations involve not only the 7 basin states and the federal government, but also a network of tribal claims that complicate any framework that attempts to allocate the river's water without addressing the unresolved rights. Tribal representatives have been participating in the formal negotiation process and have submitted detailed comments on the draft environmental impact statement. The framework that emerges, whether by consensus or by federal imposition, will have to deal with those claims one way or another, and the way the claims get treated will affect the magnitude of the cuts that fall on the basin states. The draft environmental impact statement released in January is the federal government's attempt to break the deadlock by laying out specific alternatives and inviting the public into the conversation. The 18,000 comments are the country saying in writing that this matters. The fact that the states themselves still have not agreed, 3.5 months after the comment period closed, suggests that the federal government may end up imposing a framework by administrative action. That, in turn, would almost certainly produce litigation. The legal scholars at the major Western universities have been writing about the litigation scenarios for over a year. The water utilities are quietly preparing legal teams. The basin states themselves have been positioning publicly in case the framework gets imposed rather than agreed. There is historical precedent for what happens when the basin states cannot agree among themselves. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court resolved a multi-decade dispute between Arizona and California over the division of lower basin water in a case called Arizona versus California. The decision in 1963 ran to hundreds of pages and clarified large portions of the Colorado River Compact's ambiguity. The case had taken 11 years to resolve. Whatever litigation might emerge from a 2027 legal vacuum would, on the timeline of similar past disputes, likely take years to work its way to a final determination. During that period, the Bureau of Reclamation would still operate the dams. Water would still flow, but the allocations would be operating under either a temporary administrative framework imposed by the federal government, or under the disputed assumptions of the parties to the litigation, or under some hybrid arrangement that the courts would clarify over time. The day-to-day operation of the river would not stop. The clarity that the 2007 guidelines provided would, however, dissolve. What this means, in practical terms, is that the most likely scenario for January 1st, 2027, is that the lower Colorado River will be operating under a framework that was either imposed administratively by the federal government over the objection of at least some of the basin states, or under no formalized framework at all while litigation works its way through the courts. Either of those scenarios is a kind of legal vacuum. The day-to-day operation of the river does not stop, water still flows, reservoirs still release. But the rulebook governing how shortages get declared, how cuts get apportioned, and how disputes get adjudicated becomes uncertain in a way it has not been since the original compact was signed 104 years ago. That uncertainty arrives in the same calendar week as Lake Powell crossing minimum power pool, in the same calendar year as the worst drought in 131 years, with the cities of the lower basin already implementing drought response protocols that were drafted under the existing framework and that may not survive its expiration. The first domino is the dam going dark, the second is the rulebook expiring, the third domino is the one that has already started to fall. There is one further wrinkle in the legal landscape that is worth flagging, because it shapes the litigation scenarios more than most outside observers realize. The Compact of 1922 divided the river between the upper basin and the lower basin, but it did not, at the time, formally allocate water to Mexico. A 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico subsequently obligated the United States to deliver 1.5 million acre-feet per year of Colorado River water across the southern border. That treaty obligation is binding under international law. In a shortage scenario, the question of whether the Mexican delivery can be reduced is governed by a separate set of bilateral protocols that have been periodically renegotiated through what are called minutes, formal amendments to the underlying treaty negotiated between the U.S. State Department and the Mexican Foreign Ministry. The most recent of these, Minute 323, included provisions for shared shortage management between the two countries during the existing 2007 guidelines period. Whether the post-2026 framework will include similar provisions, or what happens to the US obligation to Mexico if the domestic basin states cannot agree internally, is a layer of the negotiation that is not yet resolved. If litigation extends past the December expiration, the US obligation to Mexico continues regardless. The river still flows across the border. The question of how to share the shortage with a treaty partner becomes an additional pressure on whatever domestic framework emerges. Part 6. The cities are already rationing. While the basin states have spent the spring of 2026 negotiating the post-2026 framework, the cities of the lower basin have not been waiting for an answer. They have been activating their drought response protocols in real time. The shortage is not a forecast. It is not a projection. It is current operations. In early 2026, the city of Phoenix activated its Stage 2 drought response. Under that protocol, residential outdoor irrigation is restricted to twice per week, Decorative fountain operation is eliminated except for systems that recirculate the water. The washing of hard surfaces with potable water is prohibited outright. Second violations within a 12-month window carry a $150 fine. Third violations carry $250. These are not voluntary suggestions. They are ordinances on the city's books, enforced by code compliance officers with measurable penalties. The federal government, looking at the same Lake Mead elevation data the cities have access to, declared a Tier 2 shortage on the lower Colorado River. A Tier 2 shortage triggers automatic reductions in Arizona's and Nevada's annual Colorado River allocations, defined under the existing 2007 guidelines. Arizona absorbs the deepest first-tier cut because its water rights, under the compact and the guidelines, are junior to California's. The result is that Arizona on the federal paperwork is currently operating with less water than it has been promised, and the Phoenix and Tucson metropolitan areas are operating with less inflow from the Colorado than they had a year ago. In response to that pressure, Phoenix and Tucson have jointly created an emergency water reserve. The two cities, historically rivals for the same Central Arizona project water deliveries, agreed in early 2026 to set aside an emergency reserve specifically to hedge against deeper Colorado River cuts that everyone expects to come once the post-2026 framework is in place. It is an unusual cooperation, an indicator of how seriously both city governments are taking the trajectory of the river. The reserve is small relative to the size of the cuts that are coming, but it is a measurable step that says, on the public record, that the cities expect the next 2 years of allocation to be worse than the last two have been. Phoenix is not alone in this. The Atlanta metropolitan area, on the other side of the country, faces a different version of the same pressure for a different reason. Lake Lanier, the reservoir that serves the Atlanta water supply, is fed by the Chattahoochee River, not the Colorado, but it is being drained by the same kind of regional drought logic. On April 27, 2026, the Georgia Environmental Protection Division declared a statewide Drought Response Level One for public water systems using surface water and groundwater. As of the end of March, 96% of Georgia was in drought. That is the highest coverage Georgia has seen in several years. The Lake Lanier supply remains at functional capacity, but the headroom is declining. Atlanta has a permanent 4 p.m. to 10 a.m. sprinkler window already on its books, and Level 1 adds requirements for the city's water utility to mount an information campaign and ask for a voluntary 5 to 10% customer conservation reduction. The Atlanta water supply situation is structurally different from the Phoenix situation in one important way. Lake Lanier sits on the Chattahoochee River, which flows down through Alabama and into the Apalachicola system that empties into the Gulf of Mexico. The river is shared among 3 states, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and a multi-decade legal dispute over allocations among those 3 states has been working its way through federal courts and the Supreme Court for decades. The Atlanta Water Utility's flexibility to draw down Lake Lanier is constrained not only by the local supply but also by federal court rulings on how much downstream flow has to be maintained for Alabama agriculture and Florida oyster fisheries. When Lake Lanier's headroom shrinks under drought conditions, the legal constraints on how much can be drawn down compress the operational margin further. It is the same structural pattern as the Colorado, multiple states sharing a river, legal allocations defined by interstate agreements and federal litigation, and a drought that forces all of those legal constraints to bind simultaneously. Las Vegas, on the other side of the West, has been preparing for this moment longer than almost any major American city. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, which serves the Las Vegas metropolitan area, has been tightening its conservation rules incrementally for over a decade. Decorative grass in median strips has been banned. Residential lawns are heavily restricted. Pools are subject to specific cover and evaporation rules. The city has invested in a third intake at Lake Mead, a deep intake known as the third straw, that allows it to continue drawing water from the lake even at very low elevations. Las Vegas has, in effect, been preparing for the post-2026 environment for years, and the cuts that other cities are absorbing for the first time are cuts that Las Vegas absorbed in smaller doses years ago. That preparation does not make Las Vegas immune to the structural shortage. It does, however, make it the city with the most operational headroom going into the post-2026 period. Los Angeles, the largest single user of Colorado River water in the lower basin, has multiple sources of water and a long history of moving water across great distances to support its population. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which serves more than 19 million people across 6 counties, draws from the Colorado, from the state water project that brings water down from Northern California, and from local groundwater supplies. The Los Angeles position in the post-2026 negotiation is structurally different from the Phoenix position because California holds senior water rights that insulate it from the early tier cuts, but Los Angeles is not insulated from the broader system contraction. If the state water project's allocations are reduced because of drought in Northern California, or if groundwater overdraft restrictions tighten, the Metropolitan Water District faces pressure on its non-Colorado sources at the same time the Colorado source contracts. The city has been investing heavily in water recycling, in stormwater capture, and in groundwater banking projects to buffer against exactly this kind of multi-source pressure. The investments are real and they are large. Whether they are sufficient to absorb the magnitude of the contraction now coming remains an open question. What Phoenix and Atlanta and the Georgia Environmental Protection Division and the Federal Bureau of Reclamation are doing simultaneously in real time is operating the published drought response stages of the existing water management system. The system is not failing because the protocols do not exist. The protocols exist. The Stage 2 ordinances were drafted years ago. The Level 1 declarations are routine bureaucratic procedure. The Tier 2 shortage tier is on a federal worksheet. What is changing is that those protocols designed to handle severe but rare events are all being activated at once. There is a kind of grim normalcy to it that should not be missed. The city councils met. The state environmental agencies issued press releases. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation published the monthly study. The Phoenix Water Services Department added a new page to its website explaining what Stage 2 means for residential customers. None of this involves a coordinated conspiracy or a manufactured crisis. It is the published, audited, ordinary government response to a measurable physical crisis. And the fact that the protocols are being activated this widely, this concurrently, is itself the signal that something structural has shifted underneath the system the protocols were designed to manage. What none of these municipal stages currently address is what happens after December 31st, when the legal framework that defined the elevation tiers expires. The Phoenix Stage 2 ordinance references the existing tier structure. The Tier 2 shortage declaration is grounded in the elevation thresholds laid out in the 2007 guidelines. If those guidelines expire without a replacement, the legal grounding of those city-level protocols becomes uncertain. The cities will not stop enforcing the ordinances. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation will not stop publishing the monthly study. But the connective tissue between the federal allocations and the municipal restrictions, the legal infrastructure that has been the bridge for 18 years, becomes ambiguous in a way it has not been since the protocols were first written. The third domino, in other words, is already on the floor. The cities are rationing. The federal government has triggered the shortage tier, and the framework that defines the rules of the rationing is about to dissolve. Part 7. 2 lakes that should not be full. I want to take you to the one place in this entire story where the news appears to be good. It is a place that looks, on its own surface, like the exception to the rule. The exception is in central Texas, and it is the kind of exception that, when you understand it, makes the rest of the picture sharper, not softer. Lake Buchanan, the upper reservoir of the Highland Lake system on the lower Colorado River. And yes, there are 2 Colorado rivers in the United States. The Texas Colorado is different from the western Colorado River, which is part of why this story is confusing. Lake Buchanan, on May 25, 2026, was reading at 98.9% of full capacity. Lake Travis, the larger downstream reservoir that holds the water supply for the Austin metropolitan area, was reading at 77.6%. Together, the Highland Lakes are at levels they have not seen in 20 years. That fact, sitting next to everything I have just told you about the west and the southeast, looks like a contradiction. Lake Powell is on a trajectory to lose hydropower this year. Lake Mead is projected to fall to its lowest elevation on record. The western snowpack arrived at 23% of normal. The southeast has been in its driest stretch in over 100 years, and yet 1,200 miles south of Powell and 800 miles west of Atlanta, 2 of the largest reservoirs in Texas are nearly full. The reason they are full is straightforward and worth telling slowly. In July 2025, severe flooding hit central Texas. Multiple training thunderstorm events delivered tens of inches of rain across the Texas Hill Country in days. The Highland Lakes drainages, Lake Buchanan, Lake Travis, and the smaller lakes between and around them, received an enormous pulse of runoff. Before those July floods, the combined storage of the Highland Lakes system was at about 51% of capacity. Within days, it climbed above 90%. The lakes had been low. The flood was the refill. The July 2025 Hill Country flood was, by itself, a significant story. Multiple counties in central Texas experienced flash flooding that the National Weather Service described as catastrophic, with rainfall totals exceeding 15 inches in some drainage basins over a 48-hour window. Homes were lost, roads were washed out. The event killed people, and the same event, viewed from the perspective of the Highland Lakes operators at the Lower Colorado River Authority, was the largest reservoir refill in the system's recent history. The same water that flooded hill country towns also filled the reservoirs that those towns depend on for their long-term water supply. It is a brutal kind of mathematics. The flood that costs lives in the short term is the same event that secures the water supply in the medium term. The Lower Colorado River Authority does not get to choose how the water arrives. It gets to operate the dams and the gates that manage the water once it does. In the months since, the lakes have declined gradually, but they have stayed at levels not seen in 20 years. And then, the week this video drops, the same Omega Block atmospheric configuration that is bringing record warmth to the Dakotas is locking in a Gulf-fed storm track that is producing trained thunderstorms over West Texas and the Hill Country again. Today, May 26th, the National Weather Service issued active flash flood warnings for Pecos, Crockett, Upton, Glasscock, Midland, and Reagan counties. Between 1.5 and 5 inches of rain had already fallen in those counties by mid-morning, with rainfall rates of 3 to 4 inches per hour. The Storm Prediction Center issued a slight risk severe weather outlook for southwest and south-central Texas. The Del Rio 12 UTC sounding measured 2,200 joules per kilogram of mid-level CAPE, with mid-level lapse rates at 7.3 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Houston's atmospheric moisture content by midday was running at 1.8 to 2 inches of precipitable water, the 95th percentile of the seasonal climatology, and the Hill Country, the same drainages that fill the Highland Lakes, are set up for an overnight nocturnal flash flood threat with training thunderstorms stalling over the same spots for hours. So Lake Buchanan and Lake Travis are full, refilling, and likely to be more full by the end of this week. The contrast with Lake Powell at 57 feet of decline since last spring, with the 800,000 acre-foot April to July inflow forecast that is the lowest on record, is almost cinematic. The country, in late May 2026, no longer has a single weather story. It has two weather stories happening simultaneously in opposite directions, both of them stress tests on a national water supply system that was designed for a unified hydrology that no longer exists. The trap inside the Texas exception is that it does not save the West. The water in Lake Buchanan does not flow to Lake Powell. There is no pipeline between Texas reservoirs and the Colorado River. There never has been. The American water system was designed regionally, not nationally, and the legal infrastructure that governs water rights stops at state lines, at watershed boundaries, at compact lines drawn 100 years ago between the basin states. A wet year in Texas and a dry year in Arizona are, for the purposes of the Western water allocation problem, two completely independent events. The Highland Lakes being full is good news for Austin and for the agricultural users in the Lower Colorado River Authority service area. It is not good news for Phoenix. There have been proposals over the years for interbasin transfers, for pipelines that would move water from regions with surplus to regions with deficit. Some of those proposals have been technically feasible. None have been politically feasible at the scale that would actually matter. Moving water across continental distances is enormously expensive in terms of energy, infrastructure, and political capital. The lift required to push Colorado River water uphill from its natural drainage into another basin is so large that the energy costs alone often exceed the value of the water being moved. There are proposals that have been studied seriously by federal agencies and by university hydrology departments, and most of them have concluded that the marginal economics do not work. Interbasin transfer is, in the American context, mostly a theoretical solution. The exception is the State Water Project in California, which moves water from the northern Sierra Nevada down to southern California through hundreds of miles of canals and pumps. That project required decades of political negotiation and billions of dollars of public investment. Replicating it at the continental scale required to address the post-2026 water deficit is not a near-term option. The water in Texas stays in Texas. That is the structural fact that makes the Texas exception the most useful single image in this entire story. The country no longer has a unified water supply situation. It is fragmented into regional water economies that do not add up to a coherent national picture. And the Omega Block, the atmospheric configuration that is producing both the Texas flood threat and the Northern Plains heat dome at the same time, is the cleanest single illustration available of how one weather pattern can produce opposite water outcomes in different regions of the same country. The central thread of this video is that the American water system has run out of margin in 5 places at once, and the cities and states and federal agencies are activating drought response protocols in real time. The Texas exception is the reminder that even when one region gets lucky, the legal and infrastructural seams between regions mean the country cannot move the luck to where it is needed. The water is there, the water cannot get to the places that need it, and the Highland Lakes being at 99% of capacity, sitting in a country whose other major reservoirs are projected to lose their hydropower threshold by December, is not a contradiction. It is the perfect illustration of the problem. Part 8. One pattern, two crises. Let me stay with the Omega Block for a minute, because the atmospheric mechanism producing the Texas refill and the Powell snowmelt acceleration is the same mechanism, and the way it produces two opposite outcomes from a single configuration tells you something important about why the American water supply problem is now genuinely uncoordinated. An Omega Block is a stalled, large-amplitude jet stream pattern. The jet stream, that high-altitude river of west to east winds 7 miles overhead, is normally roughly straight, with small undulations. Under certain conditions, the jet can develop large undulations, big poleward ridges and equatorward troughs, and those large undulations can stall in place for days at a time. When they stall in the right configuration, the resulting pattern looks, on a 500 millibar height chart, like the Greek letter omega. There is a poleward ridge in the middle, flanked on each side by an equatorward trough, and the whole pattern can hold for 5 to 10 days before it breaks. The current Omega Block, the one locking into place this week, has its central ridge over the central and north-central United States. Under that ridge, air sinks. Sinking air compresses and warms. The ground beneath warms with it. Cloud cover is suppressed because rising air, the kind that builds clouds, is prevented by the descending column. Solar radiation hits the ground unobstructed. The temperature climbs. In the Dakotas, the forecast for Tuesday and Wednesday this week was 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 to 20 degrees above the normal late May reading. Humidity collapsed into the teens. Red flag warnings popped up across the plains. The heat extends west into Montana and Wyoming, into the high country of the northern Rockies, exactly the region where the remaining snowpack of the Colorado River Basin sits on the peaks. The eastern and western trough lobes of the Omega, on the other hand, are doing the opposite. Air rises under troughs, rising air cools, moisture condenses, storms form. The western lobe of this Omega Block produced the upper low over California that the ELOC's National Weather Service forecast described as unusual for this time of year, the cool marine layer 4,000 to 5,000 feet deep over Los Angeles. The eastern lobe of the Omega is fueling the Gulf-fed storm track over Texas, the one producing today's flash flood warnings, the one filling Lake Travis runoff drainages. One pattern, two opposite outcomes. The physics of why this configuration stalls, when it does, is itself worth understanding. Jet stream patterns normally migrate eastward at roughly 30 to 50 miles per hour. They translate. A weather system over Seattle today shows up over Chicago in a day and over New York in 2. The atmosphere works on a moving conveyor. But under certain conditions, when the amplitude of the jet stream's undulations gets large enough, when the wave crests get high enough and the troughs get deep enough, the pattern can stop translating and start sitting in place. The mechanism is related to the Rossby wave dynamics that govern planetary-scale atmospheric flow, and the simplest way to think about it is that large amplitude waves move more slowly than small amplitude waves, and at some critical amplitude they essentially stop. When that happens, the weather underneath each part of the wave gets the same conditions, every day, for as long as the wave holds. The ridge keeps producing heat under the ridge. The trough keeps producing storms under the trough. The system locks. Researchers have been studying whether blocking patterns of this kind are becoming more common, as the Arctic warms more rapidly than the temperate latitudes. The argument is mechanistic. If the temperature gradient between the pole and the equator weakens, the jet stream that depends on that gradient also weakens, and a weaker jet is more susceptible to large amplitude meandering and to stalling. The published evidence is mixed. Some studies show increasing frequency of blocking events in recent decades. Others show no clear trend. The mechanism is plausible, but the observational record is short enough that researchers have been cautious about declaring a strong trend. What is more clearly established is that when blocking events do occur, they tend to produce the kind of multi-region simultaneous extremes we are seeing this week. Heat in one place, flood in another, fire weather in a third, all driven by the same stalled wave. We covered some of this science in our recent videos on the jet stream and on the global heat wave. The mechanism behind the current omega block is the same mechanism. The geography is different, and here is the part that ties it back to the central thread of this video. The omega block ridge's heat side, the side over the northern plains and the Rockies, is actively accelerating the loss of the Colorado River Basin's remaining snowpack. The same omega block trough's wet side, the side over Texas and the Gulf, is actively refilling Texas reservoirs that have no operational connection to the Colorado River Basin. The atmosphere, in a single configuration, is taking water away from the place that desperately needs it, and delivering water to the place that already has it. That is not a coincidence of geography. That is the structural shape of the problem. The American water system was designed in the early 20th century around the assumption that regional hydrology was relatively stable, that the basin compacts would govern locally, and that the federal government would coordinate at the national level when truly extreme events crossed regional lines. The omega block this week is a perfect demonstration of why that assumption no longer holds. A single atmospheric pattern is producing extreme outcomes in opposite directions in different regions in the same week, and the legal and infrastructural seams between those regions mean that the country cannot redirect the water. The same pattern, by the way, is doing other things to the country that I want to keep on your radar even though they are not the main story today. The northern plains heat is dangerous in itself for vulnerable populations who are not yet acclimated to 95-degree heat in May. The Texas flash flood threat is dangerous tonight specifically along the hill country drainages, with the I-35 and I-10 corridors at nocturnal training thunderstorm risk. The drought fire interface across the Great Plains, the fire weather red flag warnings in Nebraska and the Dakotas. Those red flag warnings exist because the dry air mass under the ridge is producing the kind of low relative humidity, high wind, ignition-receptive conditions that wildfires need. The atmosphere is doing multiple things in multiple places, all of them with consequences for the water supply system, all of them happening in the same week, all of them driven by the same omega block configuration. And then, underneath all of it, there is a slower, deeper layer that the omega block does not touch, and that has been doing its work for decades regardless of what the surface weather looked like in any given month. Texas highland lakes are full. The ground underneath the Texas Panhandle, the ground that is the actual long-term water supply for Western agriculture across 6 states, is not. That is the next domino. It is the slowest one, and it is the one whose failure mode is the most permanent. Part 9. The aquifer underneath all of it. 225,000 square miles. That is the area beneath 6 states, Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska, of the Ogallala Aquifer, also called the High Plains Aquifer. It is, in volume, one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the world. It was laid down geological ages ago during the last ice age and earlier, when the climate of the central United States was wetter than it has been at any point in human history. The water held inside it is, in the most precise scientific sense, fossil water. It is not being replenished by modern rainfall at anywhere near the rate that modern agriculture is withdrawing it. The recharge rate of the Ogallala in most of its area is effectively zero on human timescales, and modern agriculture is withdrawing it at scale. The water that comes out of Ogallala wells irrigates a corridor of the high plains that produces a substantial fraction of the nation's wheat, corn, sorghum, cotton, and beef cattle feed. The economic geography of the central United States was rewritten in the middle of the 20th century when center pivot irrigation systems pulled enough Ogallala water out of the ground to turn semi-arid grasslands into one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. That transformation was real, it was successful. It also, in retrospect, was built on the implicit assumption that the water in the ground would last forever. The water in the ground will not last forever. The aquifer is being mined. The numbers are slow, and they look small when you read them, but they accumulate over decades into something irreversible. The High Plains Underground Water Conservation District, which monitors levels across a significant chunk of the Texas Panhandle, reported in 2026 that the average aquifer level change across the district for the year was negative 0.57 feet, just over half a foot of decline, on average, in 1 year. The district reports an average saturated thickness in the Ogallala of approximately 51 feet. That 51 feet of remaining saturated thickness is being drained at a rate of around half a foot a year. Some wells have dropped more than 100 feet since 2001. The cumulative decline in the Texas Panhandle since the start of large-scale irrigation totals approximately 44 feet, among the most severe declines among the 8 states that share the aquifer. A University of Texas projection, published in 2025, indicated that up to 70% of the Texas Panhandle could become unusable for irrigated agriculture within 20 years if current pumping rates continue. 70% within 20 years. The economic foundation of the entire Texas Panhandle region and significant portions of the adjacent Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado panhandles is, on a multi-decade timeline, going to thin out and fail unless extraction rates change. The decline is slow enough that the immediate annual reports look modest. The accumulated impact is not modest at all. The mechanism is what makes this part of the story particularly difficult. The aquifer's water is fossil water. It was laid down over geological time during wetter Pleistocene conditions, 20,000 years ago and more, and it is not being replenished at anywhere near the rate it is being withdrawn. Even if every well across the High Plains stopped pumping tomorrow, the aquifer would not refill in the lifetime of anyone watching this video. It would not refill in the lifetime of their grandchildren. The water that comes out of the Ogallala is, in a real sense, water from 100,000 years ago, and the geology of the High Plains does not have a mechanism for replacing it on any human-relevant timescale. It is worth slowing down on the geological detail of why that is. An aquifer is not an underground lake. It is a layer of permeable rock, sandstone in the Ogallala's case, sometimes interbedded with gravels and finer sediments, that is saturated with water held in the pore spaces between the grains. The water moves through that rock under the influence of pressure gradients, very slowly, on timescales of centuries for a given parcel of water to travel a few miles. The Ogallala Formation was laid down during the late Miocene and Pliocene epochs, between 5 and 10 million years ago, when the climate of the High Plains was much wetter, and large alluvial fans built up east of the Rocky Mountains and infiltrated the area with sediment-laden water. The water in the formation today is not all that old, but most of it has been there for at least several thousand years, with some portions dating to the wetter Pleistocene climate of the last ice age. Modern rainfall does penetrate the formation in some areas, but the rate of infiltration is on the order of fractions of an inch per year in most of the Texas Panhandle, against extraction rates that can exceed several feet of water column equivalent per acre per year for an actively irrigated field. The arithmetic is one-sided. Whatever the High Plains does in terms of policy reform, the immediate physical reality is that the aquifer's recharge mechanism cannot, on any human timescale, match its withdrawal rate. The economic implications of that arithmetic have been studied for decades. The Ogallala has been a topic of agricultural economics dissertations, of federal water policy reports, of state-level water planning documents in all 6 of the states that share it, and of journalistic investigation across the High Plains. The consensus of that research is that the aquifer cannot be sustainably extracted at current rates over a multi-decade horizon. The disagreement is about how quickly the trajectory bends. Some studies suggest that more efficient irrigation technology, drip systems, soil moisture sensors, low-pressure center pivots, can slow the rate of depletion enough to extend the usable lifetime of the aquifer by several decades. Other studies argue that efficiency gains tend to be reinvested in expanded acreage rather than in reduced total water use, and that the policy interventions required to actually reduce extraction would have to constrain acreage, not just efficiency. the University of Texas projection of 70% of the Texas Panhandle unusable within 20 years is consistent with the more pessimistic end of that literature. The optimistic end of the literature is that the same trajectory can be slowed to 40 or 50 years if substantial policy and technology interventions are implemented. None of the published literature suggests that the trajectory can be reversed. Now here is the trap that the drought adds on top of that long, slow story. In a dry year, surface water supplies fail, reservoirs run low, streams shrink. The water that an irrigator on the high plains might normally pump from a surface source disappears. The response every time is to lean harder on the aquifer. Drought years are the years irrigators draw down the Ogallala the fastest, because the surface alternative has gone away. So precisely in the years when the aquifer is in the most fragile state, when soil moisture is low, when surface flows are reduced, when the agricultural economy is under the most stress, the extraction rate accelerates. The 2026 drought year is, in all probability, a year when the Ogallala is being pumped harder than it was in 2025. The negative 0.57-foot annual decline is a number that hides the texture of the actual extraction. In a dry year like this one, the decline in any specific well or any specific subregion can be substantially higher. And the cinematic detail of this story, the detail that I want you to hold against the Highland Lakes being 99% full, is that the aquifer underneath the Texas Panhandle is depleting regardless of whether Texas Highland Lakes are full or empty. The Highland Lakes are surface water. The Ogallala is groundwater. They are different systems. The fact that Texas had a refill in 2025 does not save the aquifer. The fact that the Omega Block is dropping rain on the hill country this week does not refill the aquifer. The aquifer's water is fossil water, and the long-term trajectory underneath the Texas Panhandle is downward regardless of what the surface weather does. There is one more domino. The longest of them all is the aquifer's 70% in 20 years number. The fastest moving one is Lake Powell crossing the hydropower line by December. In between sits the new demand source that has been building quietly in exactly the regions least equipped to support it, and that does not show up in the conversation about the American water system nearly as much as it should. Part 10. The new demand that found the driest regions. The fourth domino in this story is not falling out of the sky, and it is not draining from an aquifer. It is being built with construction permits and electrical substations and fiber optic cabling on the dry ground of the American Southwest right now. The fourth domino is the data center build-out, and the reason it matters for the American water supply story is that the cooling infrastructure of modern data centers consumes water, and the modern data center industry has been citing itself with remarkable consistency in exactly the regions of the country that are running out of it. The numbers are larger than most people realize. United States data centers directly consumed approximately 66 billion liters of water in 2023. That is the most recent year for which we have a confirmed federal estimate. The trend line through 2026 is upward. The projections through the rest of this decade, accounting for the artificial intelligence build-out that has accelerated since 2024, anticipate an additional 200 to 300 billion gallons of annual US data center water consumption by 2030. That increase, on top of the existing consumption, lands as new demand on top of a national water system that is simultaneously contracting. The geographic distribution of where that new demand is landing makes the problem sharper. Roughly 2/3 of the data centers built in the United States since 2022 have been sited in regions that the federal government classifies as water-stressed. The Phoenix metropolitan area, sitting in the middle of the Tier 2 shortage allocation cut, has been one of the fastest-growing data center markets in the country. The Northern Virginia data center cluster, centered around Loudoun County, is in a region that has not historically been considered water-stressed in the same way as the Southwest, but the rate of growth has been so rapid that the county-level water supply has been strained directly. Loudoun County direct data center potable water use grew more than 250% between 2019 and 2023. By 2023, it had reached approximately 1.6 billion gallons. That was approaching 10% of all county water consumption, 10% of a county's water budget going to data center cooling, in a region that did not previously consider itself water-constrained. The reason data centers consume water is straightforward. Modern server farms run at high power densities, and the heat they generate has to go somewhere. The traditional cooling mechanism, evaporative cooling, where water is sprayed across cooling towers and the evaporation removes heat from the air conditioning loop, is highly efficient on the electricity side, but it consumes water directly. Some operators are exploring alternatives: closed-loop liquid cooling, immersion cooling in non-water dielectric fluids, air-cooled architectures with higher operating temperatures. There are several technical paths that reduce or eliminate water consumption. None of those paths is universally deployed. Most existing facilities, and most of the new construction breaking ground today, still rely on evaporative cooling. The arithmetic of evaporative cooling is worth seeing. A modern hyperscale data center with a power capacity of roughly 100 megawatts, which is a mid-size facility by current industry standards, with the largest new sites approaching 0.5 gigawatt of capacity, can consume between 500,000 and 2 million gallons of water per day for cooling, depending on the local climate and the specific cooling architecture. A facility in a hot, dry region like Phoenix typically consumes more water per unit of computing capacity than a facility in a cool, humid region like the Pacific Northwest, because evaporation removes more heat per unit of water when the surrounding air is already dry. The water footprint per query, per training run, per inference operation is small in any individual case. The footprint at the scale of the modern AI build-out, with hundreds of new facilities under construction in the most water-stressed regions of the country, is not small. It is, in aggregate, a significant new claim on regional water supplies. There is an additional layer of demand that often gets folded into the data center water number, but actually sits one step removed from it. The electricity that runs the data centers also has a water footprint. Thermoelectric power generation, coal, natural gas, nuclear, consumes water for cooling its own generation infrastructure. So a megawatt of data center electricity demand, supplied from a fossil fuel or nuclear power plant, typically carries with it an additional volume of water consumed at the power generation site. Hydroelectric power has its own different relationship to water, in that it does not consume water in the same direct way, but it depends on reservoir storage that is, as we have already discussed, declining. Solar and wind have very low operational water footprints, but they also have intermittency profiles that data centers must compensate for using battery storage or backup generation. When you add the full electricity supply chain to the direct cooling consumption, the water footprint of a modern data center cluster is larger than the direct consumption number alone, and here is the part of the story that links this domino back to the central thread. The siting of data centers in water-stressed regions is not happening because the developers do not know the water situation. They know. The development decisions are made for reasons related to electricity cost, climate suitability for the building envelope, tax incentives, fiber optic backbone proximity, and local zoning policy. The water question is real, but it is treated as a manageable input cost rather than a binding constraint. As long as the local water utility will sign a service contract, the data center gets built. The local water utility, in turn, signs the contract on the basis of current supply assumptions. When those supply assumptions deteriorate, when the Colorado River allocation gets cut, when the aquifer level drops, when the municipal drought response stage tightens, the contract is already signed and the facility is already built. There is no malevolence in this. The developers are making rational business decisions inside the framework that exists. The cities are signing the contracts because data center construction brings tax revenue, jobs, and economic development. The federal government is not, as of mid-2026, imposing national water use restrictions on data center construction siting. Each individual decision, made by an individual party, on the basis of its own local logic is defensible. The aggregate result is that the country's projected data center water demand growth is concentrated in the regions where the supply is contracting hardest, in the same calendar year that the legal framework governing the supply expires. The summer of 2026 is the moment those two trajectories meet. The lower basin allocation cuts are deepening. The Phoenix Stage 2 ordinance is in effect. The federal Tier 2 shortage is operational. The Bureau of Reclamation's monthly projections are walking Lake Powell toward minimum power pool by December, and the data centers under construction in the Phoenix metropolitan area, the Tucson corridor, the southern Nevada corridor outside Las Vegas, The Northern Virginia cluster are still being permitted, still being built, still signing water service contracts. The fifth domino, the data center demand growth, is being placed on the table at exactly the moment the other four are falling. There is a version of this video that is exclusively about the Western water supply question and treats the data center layer as a footnote. There is a version that treats the data center layer as the centerpiece and lets everything else fall away. The reason I am giving it the full part it deserves here is that the data center build-out is the new domino. It is not a legacy issue inherited from the 1922 Compact. It is not a slow grind aquifer depletion problem inherited from the 1950s. It is a new demand source, with most of its growth still ahead, that is landing on top of a contracting water system. The system is being asked to deliver more water at the same moment it is, by every available metric capable of delivering less. That brings us to the last layer of this story, and to the question every viewer is asking by this point in the video. Is there relief coming? Is there any version of the next 12 months in which the dominoes stop falling, the system recovers, and the country gets back on the trajectory it was on before this convergence year? Part 11. The El Niño that arrives too late. The answer to that question is yes, partially, and not in time. The El Niño that has been forming all spring in the equatorial Pacific is the most plausible mechanism the climate has for delivering relief to the southwestern United States. It is also the mechanism whose timing is structurally misaligned with the deadlines stacking up this year. We have covered the El Niño development arc on this channel before. In our video from May 15th on the Super El Niño implication, we walked through the food system synchronization problem and the long history of strong El Niño events disrupting global agriculture. In our video from a few days ago on the heat wave forming in the Pacific, we covered the ocean heat wave reframing of the same event, the warm pool sitting roughly 100 meters beneath the equatorial Pacific surface, the surface index still reading close to neutral, the late 2026 trajectory exceeding 3 degrees Celsius, above normal on multiple model ensembles. Both of those are worth your time if you have not seen them. I am not going to reteach the ENSO mechanics here. I'm going to walk slowly through the timing question, because the timing is what determines whether the El Niño matters for the deadlines in this video. NOAA's Oceanic Niño Index, the official measurement the federal government uses to declare ENSO state, climbed from approximately negative 0.55 in the late 2025 season to positive 0.11 for the February through April season of 2026. That is a transition from La Niña into ENSO neutral with a warming signal underneath. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, in its May 2026 discussion, put the probability of El Niño onset by the May through July period at somewhere between 82 and 98% depending on which agency forecast you read. The probability of El Niño persisting into the 2026 to 2027 winter is approximately 96%. The signal is strong. The probability that an El Niño event develops over the course of this calendar year is, by any reasonable read of the federal forecast products, very high. The trap is that El Niño's wet signal in the American Southwest does not arrive in time to refill Lake Powell or to keep Glen Canyon Dam above minimum power pool. The wettest part of the El Niño year for the Southwest is typically the late autumn and the winter, the November through March window. Even a strong El Niño does not redirect summer precipitation into the basins that need it. The summer of 2026, the one we're about to enter, sits squarely inside the period when El Niño's wet influence is at its weakest. The deadline for Lake Powell to cross minimum power pool, on the most probable trajectory of the May 24-month study, is December. The El Niño's wet influence, if it arrives at full strength, peaks in January and February. There is a gap of weeks, possibly months, between when the dam crosses the line and when the rescue mechanism starts delivering measurable refill water, and even if the El Niño arrives strong and on schedule, the refill problem is not a one-season fix. Lake Powell, at 20% of capacity at the end of water year 2026, would need multiple consecutive wet years to recover to elevations that the 7 basin states could comfortably operate against. A single wet El Niño winter delivers, in a good year, perhaps 15 to 20 feet of recovery elevation. That is meaningful. It is not transformative. A reservoir that lost 50 feet over a single dry year does not get those feet back in a single wet year. The historical record on El Niño impacts in the American Southwest is worth looking at carefully because it tempers some of the more optimistic framings of what an incoming El Niño can do. The most recent very strong El Niño event, the 2015 to 2016 winter, brought above-average precipitation to parts of Southern California, but produced essentially average winter precipitation in the Colorado River headwaters. The 2015 to 2016 El Niño was, on the basis of equatorial Pacific surface temperatures, one of the 3 strongest events in the modern record. It did not, by itself, end the Western drought. The 1997 to 1998 El Niño, another very strong event, brought significant wet impacts to Southern California, including the most expensive flood season in California history at the time. It also did not, on its own, refill the Colorado River reservoirs. The lesson of those 2 events is that even a maximally favourable El Niño does not automatically translate into southwest reservoir refill. The variability is large. The geographic specificity of the wet impacts depends on the precise phase and intensity of the equatorial Pacific warming, and the relationship between Pacific Ocean temperature and Colorado headwater precipitation is mediated by enough other atmospheric processes that the outcome in any specific year is not guaranteed. The structural mismatch is the point. The El Niño is real, it is forming on schedule, and it is likely to deliver some measure of late autumn and winter relief to the southwest. The deadlines stacked up against the western water system are arriving on a timetable that does not line up with the relief. The Bureau of Reclamation minimum power pool projection lands in December. The 2007 operating guidelines expire on December 31st. The Phoenix Stage 2 protocols are operating now. The Ogallala is grinding downward year over year regardless of any single El Niño signal. The summer of 2026 sits in between the dominoes falling and the relief arriving, and the question is not whether the rescue comes. The question is whether the rescue comes fast enough to prevent the dominoes from cascading into each other. There is one further layer of the El Niño question that is worth flagging honestly, because it complicates the relief story. El Niño's wet influence is strongest in the southwest in winter. Its other effects, the suppression of Atlantic hurricane activity, the energizing of the subtropical jet that delivers atmospheric rivers to California, the warm side teleconnections that drive drought into northern Australia and parts of the Amazon, are not all relief signals. Some of them are additional shocks landing on systems that are already strained. The summer Atlantic hurricane season is more likely to be quiet under a developing El Niño, which is good news for the Gulf Coast. The California atmospheric river season is more likely to be active, which is good news for the Sierra snowpack, but mixed news for the lower elevation flooding risk. The agricultural impacts globally, as we covered in the food synchronization video, are not uniformly positive even in years when the Southwest receives wet relief. The honest scientific framing is the one we have used on this channel since the El Niño development began. Relief is probable, but not imminent. The interval before relief arrives is the most dangerous part of the whole event, and the deadlines stacking up against the American water system in late 2026 are landing before the relief can plausibly reach them. The summer is the bridge is long, the bridge is hot, and the bridge is the part of the calendar where the 5 dominoes are scheduled to land. There is one more layer of the El Niño question that I want to put on the record honestly, because it touches on something we have discussed repeatedly on this channel, and that listeners deserve to hear addressed in this context. There is a body of speculation circulating online suggesting that El Niño development itself is being modulated by human intervention, that ocean heating projects, ionospheric facilities, or covert atmospheric engineering programs are driving the equatorial Pacific warming in ways that are not visible in the public scientific literature. We addressed the energy budget argument against this kind of framing earlier in this video, and the same argument applies here. The amount of energy required to drive the equatorial Pacific from a La Niña configuration into a developing El Niño configuration, the volume of warm water that moves, the depth of the thermocline that shifts, the surface temperature anomaly that spreads across thousands of kilometers of ocean, is at least 15 orders of magnitude larger than the total cumulative output of every facility on Earth that has ever been proposed as a candidate weather modification tool. The mismatch is not subtle. It is the mismatch between a teaspoon of warm water added to a swimming pool and the swimming pool itself. There is no published mechanism in any peer-reviewed atmospheric or oceanographic literature that operates at the energy scale required to modulate ENSO. The current developing El Niño is being driven by the same ocean-atmosphere coupling that has driven every other ENSO event in the modern instrumental record and by tree ring and coral proxy reconstructions in centuries before the modern record began. The science of ENSO is one of the better understood pieces of large-scale climate dynamics. The framing that the current event is being engineered does not survive contact with the basic energetics. That said, the legitimate scientific question of how El Niño development is being modified by the elevated baseline ocean temperature of the 21st century is real, is actively debated in the published literature, and is one of the reasons the current event's projected magnitude is so unusual. The baseline matters, the intervention framing does not. Part 12. What happens when the dominoes all fall on the same floor? So let me bring this all back together. The United States, as of the date of this recording, is sitting inside a convergence year that nobody designed. 5 independently scheduled deadlines, each with its own logic and its own clock, have improbably aligned on the same calendar. The drought is at its 131-year peak. Lake Powell, on the Bureau of Reclamation's own most probable trajectory, is projected to cross minimum power pool by December. The legal framework that has governed the lower Colorado River for 18 years expires on December 31st. The cities are already rationing. Phoenix at Stage 2, Atlanta at Level 1, federal Tier 2 shortage declared on the lower Colorado. The Ogallala is grinding toward a 20-year projection, in which up to 70% of the Texas Panhandle becomes unusable for irrigated agriculture, and the data center industry, by the same calendar, is projected to add somewhere between 200 and 300 billion gallons of new annual US water demand by 2030, with 2/3 of its post-2022 construction sited in regions the federal government classifies as water-stressed. The question that has hung over this entire video is the one I want to leave you with. If the American water system has now run out of margin in 5 places at once, all of them on the same calendar, what does the failure mode actually look like when the dominoes start to fall? The honest answer is that we do not yet know, because the country has not been through a convergence like this before. We have been through droughts. We have been through reservoir lows. We have been through municipal water restrictions. We have been through legal disputes over the compact. We have been through aquifer depletion. We have not been through all 5 at once, with all of them deepening at the same time, with a new industrial demand source landing on top in the same calendar year. The historical pattern provides limited guidance for what is coming, because there is no historical precedent at this scale. There is, however, a plausible worst case worth naming, because every responsible analysis I have seen of the 2026 trajectory has at least sketched it. The worst case is not an apocalypse. It is something more mundane and more measurable. The worst case is that Lake Powell crosses minimum power pool in December as projected. Glen Canyon Dam loses reliable hydropower generation for the next several seasons, with associated grid stress and electricity price effects across the western interconnection. The lower basin states, operating without the 2007 framework, move into a period of contested allocation under either administratively imposed federal rules or active litigation. Arizona absorbs the deepest contractual cuts. Phoenix moves from Stage 2 to Stage 3 of its drought response protocols, possibly to Stage 4. Las Vegas tightens its already strict outdoor irrigation rules. The wildfire season, already running at nearly twice the 10-year pace, extends through a hot, dry summer into a catastrophic late summer and autumn fire window. Winter wheat in the southern plains fails outright in places where it merely underperformed in 2026. Cattle herds, already at 74-year lows, contract further. Beef and dairy prices climb measurably and stay elevated for multiple years. Irrigators across the high plains, leaning harder than ever on the Ogallala, draw the aquifer down into zones from which, on any human timescale, it does not come back. Data center operators in the Phoenix metropolitan area face either involuntary curtailment of their water service contracts or a relocation pressure that pushes them toward jurisdictions with more water headroom. And the El Niño, when it arrives, delivers some measure of late autumn and winter relief to California and parts of the Southwest. But it does not refill the reservoirs in a single season, and it does not undo the legal vacuum, and it does not stop the aquifer. None of that is certain. All of it is on the table. The narrower question that is more knowable is whether any single one of those 5 dominoes can be caught before it lands. The Bureau of Reclamation projection is the most probable case under current snowpack and inflow data. A wet late spring or summer in the upper basin would push the December elevation up. The basin states could theoretically still reach a consensus post-2026 framework in the next 7 months. It would require concessions on both sides that have not yet been made, but the path is technically available. The municipalities could tighten their drought response stages preemptively, reducing demand pressure on the federal allocation cuts. Federal policy could impose, for the first time, water efficiency standards on new data center construction. None of these are easy. None of these are politically free. All of them are within the country's existing capacity to do if the will exists. The historical context for what a major water system reset has looked like in the past is also worth holding alongside the worst case. The American water system has been redesigned before in response to previous large shocks. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation itself was created in 1902 in response to the recognition that the West could not be developed without federal investment in irrigation and storage. The Hoover Dam was built in the 1930s in response to the recognition that the lower Colorado needed engineered storage. The Central Arizona Project, which delivers Colorado River water to Phoenix and Tucson, was authorized in 1968 after decades of negotiation. The 2007 guidelines were themselves a response to the dry years of the early 2000s that exposed the inadequacy of the previous framework. Each of these reforms took years to negotiate and years more to implement. The country has done large water system reforms before. It has not done them at the speed that the current convergence would require. What is harder is the deeper question underneath the deadlines. The American water system was designed in an era when the country assumed abundant water. The reservoirs were built large. The agricultural development of the West proceeded on the assumption that the Colorado would deliver 15 million acre-feet a year, when in fact it delivers closer to 13. The aquifers were tapped in the assumption that they would last forever. The cities grew in the desert on the assumption that allocations were permanent. The data centers are being built in the desert on the assumption that the water will be there. And the cumulative result by 2026 is a country whose water system was built on a stack of assumptions that have, simultaneously, stopped being true. The dominos are not a single problem. They are a system that was designed for a hydrology that no longer exists, asked to deliver to a population and an industrial base that did not exist when the design was set, in a climate that has shifted out from underneath the design assumptions. The 5 deadlines this year are not a coincidence. They are the moment on the calendar when the design assumptions and the physical reality were no longer reconcilable. The framework expires, the dam crosses the line, the cities ration, the aquifer grinds, the data centers ask for more. There is one more way to read the convergence year that I want to offer before I close, because I think it is the read that lets a person actually do something with the information. The 5 dominos are not all the same kind of problem. The hydropower threshold is a near-term engineering question. The legal expiration is a near-term governance question. The municipal rationing is a present-tense logistics question. The aquifer is a multi-decade resource economics question. The data centers are a near-term policy question. Each of those problems has actors who can do something about it. The hydropower threshold can be partially mitigated by accelerated releases from upstream reservoirs, by demand reductions on the lower basin, and by alternative grid balancing. The legal expiration can be addressed by federal administrative action, by accelerated state negotiation, or, in the worst case, by court-managed transition. The municipal rationing can be tightened preemptively, water recycling investments can be accelerated, and drought-tolerant landscaping can be incentivized. The aquifer can be slowed by efficiency mandates, by acreage constraints, by groundwater banking, by row crop transitions. The data centers can be sited under water efficiency standards, can be required to use closed-loop cooling, can be permitted on the basis of long-term supply availability rather than current contract terms. None of these are silver bullets. All of them are within the operational capacity of the existing American institutional landscape if the political will exists. The convergence is not a wall the country runs into. It is a series of decision points the country either makes or fails to make over the next 12 to 36 months. The decisions will be made by water utility boards, by state legislatures, by federal agencies, by city councils, by industry associations, by court rulings. They are not abstract. They have actors. The 5 dominos do not have to all fall in the same direction. They can be caught separately by different actors on different timetables if the actors choose to catch them. That is the optimistic read, and it is worth holding alongside the worst case. The pessimistic read is that the country has had over 20 years of warning that this convergence was coming. The 2007 guidelines expiration was a known calendar date the entire time. The Lake Powell elevation trajectory has been on the Bureau of Reclamation's monthly study for as long as the trajectory has been declining. The Ogallala depletion has been documented in agricultural extension publications since the 1970s. The data center water footprint has been a topic in trade publications since at least the 20-teens. None of these are surprises. All of them have been visible, and the country has collectively not yet produced the coordinated response that the timing would have required if the response was going to be in place before the dominoes started falling. The institutional and political machinery has not moved at the pace the physical system has changed. That gap between the speed of change and the speed of governance is the deeper story underneath the 5 dominoes, and it is the story that will shape whether the next round of similar convergences in 2030 or 2035 or 2040 finds a country better prepared than the one we are in right now. And the question I leave you with, the question that should hang over every conversation about American water for the next 12 months, is this. If the country built its entire water system on the assumption of abundance, and the abundance has now run out in 5 places on the same calendar, is there any version of the next 12 months in which the country gets to keep behaving as if that assumption is still true? The first domino is already on the floor, the second is in the air, the third is being pushed, the fourth is grinding, the fifth is being built. They are all moving toward the same line, and the line is not in the future. The line is December. Watch the elevation, watch the negotiation, watch the cities, watch the aquifer, watch what the country chooses to do, and what the country chooses not to do, in the 7 months between now and the deadline. The water that built the American West is running out, and the rulebook that managed the water is running out with it, and the institutions that were supposed to catch the failure have not yet moved at the pace the failure is moving. We have been told in different ways and from different directions for over 20 years that this convergence was coming. The convergence is here.